I never thought my life would come to this. Me, an old man in his late 60s, sitting alone in a quiet house in Dallas, Texas, with nothing but memories and silence to keep me company. My name doesn't matter much. What matters is the path I took, the choices I made, and the betrayal that would one day cut deeper than anything I could have imagined. It all began more than a decade ago, long before people started throwing the word Bitcoin around like it was a lottery ticket. Back then, it wasn't glamorous. In 2012, I was still working as an electrical engineer, fiddling with old computer parts, and teaching myself about the future of money. I read articles on tech blogs, sometimes staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning, trying to wrap my head around what it meant to own a digital coin. At that time, Bitcoin was worth next to nothing. You could buy one for the price of a sandwich at a diner, and that's exactly what I did. Instead of spending on coffee or fast food, I put a little aside each month. $10 here, $20 there. I wasn't rich, not by any means, but I was disciplined. Slowly, steadily, I built up my stash until one day I realized I had 600 coins sitting in a digital wallet. 600. Most people I knew thought I was crazy. My co-workers laughed. Even my daughter Emily would roll her eyes when I brought it up over dinner. "Dad, that stuff's fake," she'd say. But I didn't mind. I wasn't doing it for approval. I was doing it because something told me this experiment might mean something one day. The years passed. Life carried on. I retired early after decades of hard work, and I settled into a quieter rhythm. Emily went off to college, then married a man named Ryan who worked in real estate. I never cared much for him. He always had that slick salesman smile, the kind that looks friendly but hides calculation. Still, he was her choice, and I supported her as best as I could. Meanwhile, those 600 Bitcoins sat untouched. I kept them on a hardware wallet I locked away in a fireproof safe alongside old family photos and my wife's wedding ring. She passed when Emily was only 13, and I'd been both mother and father since then. I carried the weight of that responsibility with pride. Every sleepless night, every double shift, every sacrifice was for her. I thought one day, when the time was right, I'd hand over the keys to that fortune. It wasn't just money, it was security opportunity, a legacy. Then the price of Bitcoin started to climb. What was once a few $100s became thousands, tens of thousands. I watched my modest gamble transform into a fortune beyond anything I could have dreamed of. 600 coins. By the time I was in my late 60s, it was worth hundreds of millions. Sometimes I'd just sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the numbers on my screen, barely able to comprehend it. Me, a retired engineer in a small Texas house, quietly sitting on a mountain of digital gold. But I never told Emily. I never told Ryan. The way they spoke about money, the way Ryan always asked about investments, the way Emily seemed more interested in vacations and status than family dinners, it all gave me pause. Something inside me whispered, "Wait, see who they are when they think you have nothing." I lived modestly, drove the same old Ford pickup I'd had for years, kept the house clean but simple. No fancy vacations, no new toys, no mansion. People probably thought I was just another retiree living on a pension. That's exactly how I wanted it. Still deep down, I wrestled with loneliness. I wanted to believe Emily still cared about me as her father, not as a bank account. Every phone call, every short visit, I searched for proof. But the truth was hard to ignore. She only reached out when she needed something. Help with a down payment, a loan for home renovations. Never just a "how are you, Dad?" I told myself it was normal that kids get busy with their lives, but I knew better. I could feel the shift, subtle at first, then undeniable. The bond we once shared after her mother died was fading into something colder. That's when the idea began to form in my mind. A test. A way to know once and for all whether I mattered to her for who I was or for what I had. I didn't act on it right away. For weeks, I sat in the living room late at night, turning it over in my mind. The grandfather clock ticked in the background as I imagined scenarios. If I told her I lost everything, would she still hug me? Would she still sit at the table and eat dinner with me, even if I had nothing to offer? Or would she push me away like an old coat, no longer needed? My heart ached at the thought, but I needed to know. It wasn't about cruelty, it wasn't about punishing her, it was about truth. So, one evening while having dinner at her house, I casually let it slip. I told her I'd once invested in Bitcoin years ago, built up quite a stash, but recently made a terrible mistake. I claimed I lost the password, the keys, and that all 600 coins were gone, vanished into the ether. I watched her face carefully. At first surprise, then disappointment, then something else, something colder. She forced a smile, but I saw it. Ryan didn't even bother hiding his reaction. He leaned back in his chair, let out a quiet, "Damn," and changed the subject. That night, driving home, I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I knew in that moment the test had only begun. Because if that small lie made them look at me differently, I had to see what would happen when I needed them most. I had to see if love was still there, or if it had been sold off piece by piece in exchange for dreams of wealth. And that thought, as painful as it was, set everything else into motion. After that night at Emily's house, I drove home in silence. The streets were empty, lit only by the glow of street lamps, and the hum of the old Ford filled the void. My thoughts felt heavier than the truck itself. I replayed the dinner over and over in my mind, searching for something, anything, that might have reassured me. But all I saw was the flicker in Emily's eyes, the disappointment that she hadn't even tried to hide. It was a look I'll never forget. You see, when you raise a child on your own, you carry their heart inside yours. I remembered the nights after her mother passed away, when Emily would crawl into my bed, clutching her blanket, whispering, "Don't leave me, Daddy." I had sworn then that I never would. Through every scraped knee, every broken heart, every graduation and milestone, I stood by her. And yet, sitting at her dinner table years later, it was as if none of that mattered. My worth in her eyes was measured in coins I supposedly no longer had. In the weeks that followed, I started to notice the cracks widening. Emily called less often. When she did, it was rushed, distracted like I was a chore on her to-do list. Ryan, meanwhile, seemed more emboldened than ever. He sent me articles about retirement mistakes, about how older folks lost fortunes with bad planning. I knew what he was doing. Subtle jabs, little reminders that I was in his mind just another fool who'd squandered his chance at wealth. It stung, more than I wanted to admit. At church on Sundays, I watched other families sitting together, children hugging their parents, whispering in their ears. I sat alone, nodding politely at familiar faces, but inside I carried an ache. I wasn't jealous exactly, but I felt cheated. After all I'd given, all I'd sacrificed, was I really so easy to discard? One afternoon, I decided to stop by Emily's house unannounced, just to see her. I brought a box of her old belongings I'd kept in the attic, yearbooks, trophies, photos. I thought maybe it would spark something, remind her of the bond we once shared. When I knocked, Ryan answered the door. His smile was thin, polite, but cold. "Emily's busy," he said, barely glancing at the box in my arms. He didn't invite me in. Instead, he stood there like a bouncer at the door of a nightclub. I handed him the box anyway, forcing a smile. But as I walked back to my truck, I felt the sting of humiliation. A week later, Emily finally called. Not to thank me, not to reminisce, but to ask if I could help them with a short-term loan. Ryan had some new business deals, something about flipping houses in Austin. They just needed $50,000 for a few months. I sat there holding the phone listening, but I couldn't hear the words anymore. All I could think about was that look at the dinner table, the way Ryan blocked the door, the way my own daughter sounded more like a bill collector than a child reaching out to her father. I told her no. My voice cracked when I said it, but I stayed firm. The silence on the other end was deafening. Then came the sigh, sharp and disappointed. "Okay, Dad," she said flatly before hanging up. "No, I love you. No, how are you?" Just the end of a transaction that never was. That night, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat in the living room, staring at the empty chair where her mother used to sit. I imagined what she would say if she were still alive. She had always been softer, gentler. Maybe she would have convinced Emily to see me differently. Maybe she would have reminded her that love isn't conditional. But she was gone, and I was left alone with the reality. My daughter wasn't the little girl with pigtails anymore. She was a woman shaped by her own choices, influenced by a husband who saw me not as family, but as an obstacle. And so the cracks became canyons. I noticed other small things too. Social media posts where Emily flaunted vacations, expensive dinners, designer clothes. Not once did she tag me, mention me, or thank me for the years that made those comforts possible. It was as if I no longer existed in her story. One evening, while scrolling online, I saw a picture she'd posted her and Ryan standing in front of a brand new SUV beaming. The caption read, "Hard work pays off." I nearly laughed out loud. Hard work. They hadn't worked half as hard as I had in my life. And yet here, they were living as if money grew on trees. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark. The bitterness threatened to swallow me whole, but beneath it a strange calm began to settle. I realized something important that night. I couldn't control Emily's choices. I couldn't force her to love me the way I wanted, but I could control mine. If they wanted to treat me like I was worthless without my Bitcoin, I'd show them what worth really meant. If they wanted to measure me in dollars, I'd show them value beyond money. It was then that the idea solidified. Not just a test, but a plan. A way to reveal their true colors to the world and to myself. I went to bed with a strange peace, even though my heart still ached, because I knew deep down that betrayal wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of my revenge. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became. If I wanted to truly know where I stood in my daughter's heart, I needed to press the test further. That first slip at the dinner table had been enough to show me disappointment in her eyes, but part of me still hoped I was wrong. Maybe I'd misread her expression. Maybe Ryan's reaction was clouding my judgment. Maybe Emily still had that soft place in her heart for me, buried under the weight of Bill's marriage in adulthood. But my gut told me otherwise. So I leaned into the lie. At church with neighbors, even in passing conversations with acquaintances, I dropped little hints about having lost my Bitcoin fortune. I wanted the story to spread naturally, to drift its way back to Emily, without me having to repeat it to her directly. In a small community, gossip moves faster than any newspaper. I knew it wouldn't be long before she heard about it more than once. Sure enough, within 2 weeks she called, not to ask how I was holding up, but with a tone of forced politeness, like someone making a courtesy call. "Dad, I heard. Something happened with your investments." That's what she called it, investments. She couldn't even bring herself to say the word Bitcoin. I told her the story in full this time. I said I'd been careless, that I'd written down the seed phrase incorrectly, that no matter how many combinations I tried, the coins were gone forever. I told her I'd lost 600 Bitcoins worth hundreds of millions at today's prices. I even chuckled bitterly, as if making light of my own foolishness. On the other end of the line, silence. Then the obligatory, "I'm so sorry, Dad." But the words were hollow, drained of warmth. I could hear Ryan muttering in the background, his voice sharp, though I couldn't make out the words. I hung up the phone, feeling like I'd just been weighed and measured and found lacking. After that, the calls came even less frequently. Weeks stretched into a month without a visit. The holidays came, and for the first time since Emily was born, she didn't spend them with me. She sent a card in the mail, a generic one with glittery snowflakes, her name, and Ryan's printed neatly inside. No handwritten note, no photograph of the family, just an envelope as if fulfilling an obligation. I sat alone on Christmas Eve staring at the twinkling lights on the tree, remembering the years I stayed up all night, assembling toys, baking cookies, wrapping presents. I thought about the joy on Emily's face as a child, the way she used to hug me, tight in gratitude. All of that felt like another lifetime, another world. The lie I told was working, but it was cutting me deeper than I expected. Still, I needed to push further. So one day in January, I decided to visit Emily and Ryan unannounced. I showed up at their new home, a sprawling two-story in a suburban neighborhood, filled with perfectly trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes. I brought a small bag with me filled with some old family heirlooms, a pocket watch that belonged to my father, a quilt my wife had sewn before she died. I told myself I just wanted to give Emily something meaningful in case she thought I had nothing else to offer. But when I rang the doorbell, Ryan answered. He looked surprised, then irritated. His smile was tight. "Emily's busy," he said again, like a script he'd repeated before. He didn't invite me in. I asked if I could just leave the bag for her, and he nodded, taking it from me as if it were a burden. I stood there on the porch for a moment, waiting for Emily to appear, to peek her head around the corner, to at least wave, but she never did. The door closed, and I was left staring at the wreath hanging on it, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. Driving home, I told myself it was enough. I had seen the truth, yet part of me wasn't satisfied. I needed them to reveal themselves completely. I needed them to make it undeniable. That's when I decided to take the test to its limit. The next time Emily called this time to ask if I could co-sign a loan Ryan was trying to secure, I played my part perfectly. I told her gently that I couldn't, that without my Bitcoin, I had little to fall back on, that I was just trying to scrape by on my retirement checks. Her sigh on the other end was unmistakable. Not concern, not sympathy, frustration, disappointment. "Okay, Dad," she said flatly. And that was it. She hung up, leaving me with the dial tone. I sat in my recliner for a long while after that, staring at the ceiling. The old fan spun above me, creaking every few seconds like it was reminding me of the passage of time. My chest hurt, not just with sadness, but with clarity. They saw me as nothing now. Nothing but an old man without money. And strangely, that realization brought me a sense of calm, because once you know the truth, there's nothing left to fear. The mask had slipped. Their love, their affection, it was never unconditional. It was transactional, and without the promise of wealth, I was expendable. That night, I poured another glass of whiskey and looked at the safe tucked away in my study. Inside it sat the hardware wallets, the real ones holding all 600 bitcoins, untouched, secure. My fortune was still there, and so was my plan. I whispered to myself in the quiet of that room, if they want to see me as worthless without money, then I'll show them what true worth looks like with or without them. From that moment on, the wheels of revenge began to turn. It was a cold February evening when I finally decided to do it. For weeks, I had been carrying the lie like a weight on my chest, pretending that I had lost everything, watching as Emily and Ryan slowly drifted further and further away. Each phone call, each conversation confirmed what my heart already suspected, that their love for me was tied to the size of my wallet, not the size of my heart. But still, I needed to know for certain. I needed to look my daughter in the eyes and see without any doubt what I meant to her now. I drove over to her house just after dusk. The sky was turning purple, streetlights flickering on one by one. Their neighborhood was the kind of place where every lawn looked the same, every driveway filled with shiny cars, every front porch decorated like a page from a magazine. My old Ford pickup looked out of place as I pulled up at the curb. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. My hands were cold, my breath fogging up the glass. I told myself I was just there to talk, to find comfort, maybe to share a meal together like old times. I wanted to believe she would invite me in, sit me down, and reassure me that no matter what happened to the Bitcoin, I was still her father, that I still mattered. Finally, I gathered my courage, stepped out of the truck, and walked up the pathway to the door. My knees ached, but I forced myself up the steps and rang the bell. I could hear voices inside. The TV was on, laughter spilling from the speakers. Then footsteps. The door swung open, and there was Ryan. His smile vanished the moment he saw me. What are you doing here?" His tone was flat annoyed, as if I'd interrupted something important. "I just wanted to see Emily," I said quietly. "I thought maybe we could talk." For a moment, he just stood there, blocking the doorway. Then Emily appeared behind him. For the briefest second, I thought I saw a flicker of softness in her face, a memory of the little girl who once clung to my hand, but it vanished quickly, replaced by irritation. "Dad, this isn't a good time," she said, crossing her arms. I tried to explain, fumbling with my words. Things have been hard since losing the Bitcoin. I thought maybe I could spend some time here just for a little while. My throat tightened. I could use some comfort. Ryan let out a short laugh, humorless and sharp. "Look, we can't take care of you, okay? You made your choices. If you lost all that money that's on you." Emily's face hardened. Her voice was sharper than I'd ever heard it. "Dad, you need to go. We have our own problems to deal with. You can't just show up like this." And then came the words that cut deeper than any knife. "Go away." 3 syllables. That was all it took to shatter everything. I stood there staring at them, my ears ringing. My heart felt like it had been ripped from my chest. I wanted to argue, to remind her of every sacrifice, every night I stayed awake, worrying about her, every meal skipped so she could have more. But the words wouldn't come. My tongue felt heavy, my mouth dry. So I just nodded, turned, and walked back down the steps. My vision blurred as tears filled my eyes, though I refused to let them fall until I was inside my truck. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The house behind me glowed warm and inviting, laughter and television noise spilling out, but it wasn't mine. It never would be again. I started the engine, the old truck rattling to life, and pulled away slowly. My chest ached, my stomach churned, but beneath the pain was something else: clarity. They had shown me exactly who they were. No more pretending, no more hoping, no more excuses. By the time I got home, the tears had dried on my cheeks, leaving only the hollow ache of betrayal. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, staring at the safe across the room, the one that held the hardware wallets with all 600 bitcoins. The fortune was still there, untouched, as real as ever. And in that moment, I realized something. Their rejection wasn't the end of my story. It was the spark that lit the fire of my revenge. They thought I was worthless without money. They thought I was just another old man who had squandered his fortune. But soon, the world would see the truth. And when they did, Emily and Ryan would be forced to face the consequences of the words they threw at me so carelessly. Go away. If that was what they wanted, then I would give them exactly that permanently, but not before showing them and everyone else the true measure of who I was. That night, sleep never came. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the heater and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emily's face at the door, cold, distant. Those words, "go away," echoed in my head like a hammer striking an anvil. I kept asking myself how it had come to this. How had the little girl who once clung to me in fear of thunderstorms become a woman who turned me away like a beggar on her doorstep? I thought of all the sacrifices, all the choices I'd made for her future. The promotions I turned down so I could be home more often. The nights I worked overtime to afford her braces, her tuition, her first car. Every penny, every drop of sweat had been for her. And yet in her eyes it was gone, erased. None of it mattered anymore because she believed I had nothing left to give. The grief was overwhelming at first. My chest felt heavy, my throat raw from holding back tears. I shuffled into the kitchen around midnight and poured myself a glass of water, staring at my reflection in the dark window. The man looking back at me was tired, his face lined with years of labor and worry. But behind his eyes, something new was forming, something sharp. It wasn't rage exactly. It wasn't the kind of anger that makes you throw things or shout at the sky. No, it was quieter than that. It was resolve. If they had chosen greed over love, then I would answer in kind, not with violence, not with shouting, but with dignity, with something they couldn't argue against, something they couldn't erase. I walked to the study, turned on the lamp, and opened the safe. Inside, the hardware wallets rested exactly where I had left them alongside the papers I had carefully stored for years. I picked one up, feeling the weight of it in my hand. To most, it would look like nothing more than a small piece of plastic and metal, but to me, it was proof that I hadn't been foolish, that I hadn't lost everything. 600 bitcoins, still safe, still mine. I placed the wallet back carefully and sat down at the desk. My mind, once clouded with grief, now began working with the precision of the engineer I had been all my life. I thought of contingency plans, of wills and estates, of how money can shape legacies. If Emily and Ryan wanted to measure me in dollars, then I would make sure every dollar counted for something they would never touch. But revenge, I knew, wasn't just about money. It was about truth, about revealing who people really were when faced with a test. And Emily had failed hers. So the plan began to take shape. First, I would make sure my estate was airtight. No loopholes, no way for Emily or Ryan to challenge it. I would contact a lawyer, someone I trusted, and rewrite everything so that the fortune bypassed them completely. Instead, it would go to causes that mattered: children in need, hospitals, scholarships, the kind of places where money could heal instead of corrupt. Second, I would make it public. Quiet revenge might satisfy me privately, but true justice would be in the exposure. I wanted Emily and Ryan to wake up one morning, open their newspaper, and see my name plastered across the front page, not as a failure, not as a man who lost everything, but as a benefactor who had given more than they could ever dream of. I wanted them to feel the weight of regret, to realize that while they were chasing comfort and greed, I was building a legacy. The thought gave me strength. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The betrayal still stung, but now it had direction. It was no longer a wound, it was fuel. I sat back in the chair, closed my eyes, and thought about my wife. If she were here, I wondered, would she think I was being too harsh, or would she understand? She had always believed in fairness in teaching lessons, not with cruelty, but with consequence. I like to think she would be proud of me, proud that I wasn't letting bitterness consume me, but instead channeling it into something meaningful. By dawn, the plan was etched firmly in my mind. I made myself a pot of coffee, the aroma filling the kitchen, and watched the sun rise through the blinds. The light spilled across the room, chasing away the shadows, and I felt ready. They thought they had seen the end of me. They thought I was finished, worthless, irrelevant, but they hadn't seen anything yet. I took a sip of coffee, set the cup down, and whispered into the stillness of the room. "You wanted me to go away. Fine, but when I do, it won't be in silence. It'll be in headlines. From that moment forward, every step I took was deliberate. Every move was preparation. The time for grief was over. The time for revenge had begun. The morning after I made my decision, I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad in front of me. I hadn't used one in years. Most things were typed on a laptop or jotted in a phone, but there was something grounding about putting pen to paper. Each line I wrote felt like a promise to myself, a blueprint for the last chapter of my life. Step 1, protect the Bitcoin. I already had my hardware wallets locked safely away, but I knew that wasn't enough. I contacted a trusted estate lawyer in downtown Dallas, a man I'd used before for small matters. We met in his office a few days later, the air heavy with the scent of leather and polished wood. I didn't tell him everything at once, too risky, but enough to make it clear I needed airtight documents. A new will, clear language, specific clauses that couldn't be challenged in court. "Do you have heirs?" he asked, glancing at me over his glasses. I swallowed hard. "I have one daughter," I said slowly, "but let's just say she won't be inheriting anything." He didn't press. Lawyers rarely do. Instead, he nodded and began drafting papers. Together, we created a plan that redirected the bulk of my estate, my home, my savings, and yes, the Bitcoin to causes that mattered. Children's hospitals, orphanages, scholarships for underprivileged students. Each allocation was deliberate. Each dollar was a message. Step 2, make it public. It wasn't enough for Emily and Ryan to be cut out quietly. I wanted them to see what they had thrown away with their own eyes. I wanted the world to see it too, so there could be no denying what had happened. That's when I reached out to several charitable organizations. I arranged meetings with directors, explained that I wanted to make a significant donation anonymous at first, but eventually tied to my name when the time was right. Their eyes widened when I mentioned the numbers. Millions, not thousands. Entire wings of hospitals could be built, entire schools funded. They treated me with respect, but more importantly, with gratitude. Real gratitude. Not the conditional kind I'd seen in my daughter's eyes, but the genuine thankfulness of people who knew what it meant to struggle and who understood what such a gift could do. For the first time in months, I felt valued not for what I could give them, but for the lives that money would touch. Step 3, timing. Revenge isn't just about what you do, it's about when you do it. I wanted the reveal to be sharp, unforgettable, and public enough that Emily and Ryan would feel the sting without me having to say a single word to them. I arranged for the donations to be announced at a press event. A children's hospital in Dallas was expanding its facilities, and they were eager to showcase such a generous benefactor. Local news stations were invited, photographers, even the mayor was scheduled to attend. The plan was perfect. As the pieces fell into place, I found myself moving through each day with a strange mixture of grief and determination. I still thought about Emily constantly. Memories came unbidden, her small hand in mine at the zoo, the way her eyes lit up when she opened her first bicycle on Christmas morning. Those memories twisted the knife, reminding me of what I had lost. But they also steeled my resolve, because the woman who had told me to go away was not that little girl anymore. She had made her choice, and now I was making mine. I spent the evenings preparing quietly, almost ritualistically. I organized documents. I checked and rechecked the security of my Bitcoin wallets. I wrote letters, some to the charities, some to old friends, and one final one to Emily, not to be sent now, but to be delivered only after everything was finished. It wasn't a letter of anger. It wasn't even a letter of explanation. It was simply the truth laid bare in my own handwriting. The truth of what she had done, and what I had decided as a result. Days blurred into weeks, and soon the date of the event drew near. On the night before, I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching the Texas sky. Stars glittered above me, and the air was crisp, almost cleansing. I thought about my wife again, wondered what she would think of all this. I hoped she would understand. More than that, I hoped she would be proud. Because tomorrow, I wasn't just an old man with a safe full of digital coins. Tomorrow, I would be something else entirely. A benefactor, a man who turned betrayal into purpose. And tomorrow, Emily and Ryan would finally see me for what I was: not a failure, not a fool, but a father who had been worth far more than they ever realized. The thought carried me to bed, and for the first time in months, I slept without dreams. The morning of the event, I woke before dawn. For a moment, lying in bed, I almost forgot what day it was. Then it hit me. Today was the day everything would change. I brewed coffee and sat quietly at the kitchen table, the steam rising in front of me. My hands trembled as I lifted the cup. It wasn't fear exactly, it was the weight of finality. For months, I had carried the betrayal in silence, the lie of my lost Bitcoin fortune crushing me from the inside. But today, the silence would end. By 8 o'clock, I had dressed in my best suit. It wasn't new, but it was clean and pressed. The navy blue jacket fit a little tighter around my shoulders than it used to, but I buttoned it anyway. I shaved, carefully combed my thinning hair, and polished my old dress shoes. I wanted to look the part. Not of a rich man flaunting his wealth, but of someone dignified, someone whose life meant more than the money he carried. A driver from the hospital came to pick me up. On the ride downtown, I stared out the window at the city waking up. Dallas looked the same as always, commuters rushing billboards, flashing horns, honking. No one knew that sitting in the back of that sedan was a man about to reveal a secret worth hundreds of millions. When we pulled up to the hospital, I saw the crowd already gathering. A small stage had been set up near the new wing under construction banners flapping in the wind. Photographers stood ready, cameras hanging from their necks. A local news van idled at the curb, its satellite dish pointed skyward. My heart pounded. Inside the hospital, I was greeted by the director, a kind woman with silver hair and warm eyes. She shook my hand firmly. "We are so grateful for your generosity," she said, and I could tell she meant it. We walked together to the stage. I could hear the hum of the crowd, the shuffle of reporters, the faint feedback of microphones being tested. The mayor was there too, his suit crisp, his smile rehearsed. He gave me a nod of respect, and for the first time in a long while, I felt seen not as a burden, not as an old man, but as someone who mattered. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped up to the podium, my hands gripping the edges to steady myself. The microphone squealed, then settled. I took a breath and looked out at the faces before me. I stand here today, I began my voice steadier than I expected, not as a wealthy man, but as a grateful one. I told them about my life briefly, without details of betrayal or pain. I spoke about being an engineer, about raising my daughter alone after losing my wife, about the long nights of sacrifice. I mentioned the Bitcoin only in passing, calling it a blessing I never expected. And then I explained why I was giving it away. Money on its own means nothing, I said, my throat tightening. But when it can build hospitals, fund scholarships, and change lives, it becomes something far greater than wealth. It becomes legacy. Applause broke out. I stepped back, and the director of the hospital presented a large ceremonial check. The number printed on it made my stomach flip. $50 million donated in Bitcoin. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, and I stood there smiling faintly, though inside my chest was still heavy with the truth of why I was really there. Afterward, I shook hands, posed for photos, answered a few polite questions. The mayor praised my generosity. The hospital staff hugged me. The news crew interviewed me briefly, and I kept my answers simple, humble. I didn't crave the spotlight, but I knew the spotlight was necessary. That night, when I returned home, I collapsed into the recliner exhausted. I turned on the television, and there it was, the local news segment. My face filled the screen, my voice playing back as the anchor announced retired engineer donates $50 million in Bitcoin to Children's Hospital. They showed the ceremony, the checks, the smiling children who would benefit. I sat there in the glow of the TV, my heart both aching and at peace, because I knew without even seeing it yet that Emily and Ryan would be watching too. Somewhere across town in their pristine living room, they would see the same images. They would hear the same words. They would realize that the fortune they thought I had squandered, the fortune they turned their backs on, was not only intact, but being used for something greater than themselves. And they would remember the night they told me to go away. The thought didn't make me happy, not in the joyful sense, but it did give me closure. They had made their choice, and now they would have to live with the weight of it. As the segment ended, I muted the TV and sat in silence. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to peace. Not because I had hurt them, but because I had reclaimed my worth. I whispered into the quiet room, "Now the world knows who I really am." The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The sun had just started creeping through the blinds, and the house was quiet, except for the ticking clock in the hallway. I shuffled into the kitchen, made myself a cup of coffee, and unfolded the morning newspaper that had been tossed onto the porch. And there it was. my face smiling faintly as I shook hands with the hospital director. The headline stretched across the front page. Retired engineer donates $50 million in Bitcoin to Children's Hospital. Seeing it in print made my chest tighten. All those years of secrecy, all those months of pretending, and now the truth was out in the open for the world to see. For once, my story wasn't one of loss, it was one of giving. I traced my finger along the words, the ink faintly smudging. A strange calm settled over me. This wasn't about revenge anymore, not really. It was about legacy, about showing that even in betrayal, I could choose dignity. But I couldn't deny that part of me wondered what Emily thought when she saw it. I didn't have to wonder long. By mid-morning, my phone began to buzz. Calls, messages, voicemails stacking one after another. At first from numbers I didn't recognize, reporters no doubt, but then from Emily. Dozens of missed calls. A flurry of texts. "Dad, please call me. Why didn't you tell us we need to talk? Please." I sat in my recliner, the phone buzzing against the table beside me, and I didn't move to pick it up. I just watched it light up again and again, like a desperate heartbeat. I imagined their house that morning. Emily at the breakfast table, her hands trembling as she unfolded the same paper, the words staring back at her. Ryan cursing under his breath, realizing they had turned me away, mocked me, discarded me, only to see the truth splashed across headlines. I pictured Emily crying regret, pouring down her face, as she remembered the night I stood on her porch, asking for comfort, only to be told to go away. And I wondered, was she crying for me, or for the fortune she had lost? The thought was painful, but I knew the answer in my gut. It was never about me. It was about what I represented in dollars and cents. By noon, I finally listened to one of her voicemails. Her voice was breaking, panicked. "Dad, I'm so sorry. We didn't mean it. We didn't understand. Please, can we talk? Please just come over." I closed my eyes listening, but I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just emptiness. I set the phone down and let it ring again. That evening, the local news replayed the segment. Neighbors knocked on my door to congratulate me. Letters began arriving in the mail from strangers, thanking me for my generosity. I read every one of them slowly, carefully, letting their words wash over me. They saw me not as a man who had lost everything, but as someone who had given back. But Emily's silence weighed heavier than the praise. The next day, she showed up at my door. I saw her through the window before she knocked her figure small against the porch light. She looked nervous, her eyes red from crying. Ryan stood a step behind her, his face tight with forced humility. I didn't answer the door. I sat in the dark living room, watching their shadows shift across the frosted glass, listening to the muffled sound of Emily's voice begging, pleading. "Dad, please, just let me in. Please." But I stayed still, my hands gripping the arms of the chair, my heart heavy but resolute. They had made their choice the night they told me to leave. They had written their truth in the coldness of their voices, and now they had to live with it. After a while, the knocking stopped. Their footsteps faded. Silence filled the house again. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. A part of me longed to open that door, to forgive, to cling to the daughter I once knew. But the larger part of me knew forgiveness couldn't erase the truth. Trust once broken doesn't return. In the quiet, I whispered to myself, this was never about punishment, it was about clarity. And clarity had come. The days after the headlines were strange ones. My quiet life, which had once felt invisible, was suddenly illuminated. Strangers recognized me in the grocery store, shaking my hand, thanking me for what I had done. Neighbors who had barely nodded before now waved enthusiastically, calling me generous, kind, and inspiration. But beneath the praise, my heart carried a weight I couldn't shake. The world saw me as a philanthropist, a man who had given away millions. But I knew the truth. This wasn't about charity alone. It was about betrayal, about love, tested and found lacking. And then one evening, it happened again. I was sitting in my recliner with a book in my lap when I heard the knock at the door. Firm, urgent. I didn't move at first, but then I heard her voice. "Dad, it's me. Please open the door. Emily." I froze my heart hammering. Slowly, I stood and walked to the window. There she was standing on the porch. Her coat was buttoned tight against the cold, her eyes red and swollen. Ryan wasn't with her this time. She was alone. For a moment, my resolve wavered. My daughter, the little girl I had raised, the child who had once been my entire world, stood just a few feet away. I could almost hear her laughter from years ago echoing across the porch. For a split second, I wanted to throw open the door, to hold her, to believe we could erase everything that had happened. But then I remembered the sting of her voice that night, the way her arms were crossed, the hardness in her eyes. "Go away." I stepped back from the window. The knocking grew louder. "Dad, please. I was wrong. I didn't mean it. I didn't understand. Please just talk to me." Her words pierced me, but they couldn't undo the truth. I knew now what she had valued all along. It wasn't me. It wasn't love. It was money. And the moment she thought I had none, she had cast me aside. I sat back in the recliner, staring at the dark television screen, listening to her muffled cries on the other side of the door. My hands trembled as I gripped the arms of the chair. Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. This was the test. This was the lesson. After a while, the knocking slowed. Then it stopped. Through the window, I watched her shoulders sag. She stood there a moment longer, as if hoping the door might open on its own. Then slowly, she turned and walked back to her car. The taillights glowed red as she drove away, disappearing into the night. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there for a long time staring at the door. My heart felt like a stone in my chest. I hated that it had come to this. I hated that the girl I had loved with every fiber of my being had chosen greed over family. But hate wasn't enough to change it. Nothing was. Finally, I rose, walked to the front door, and turned off the porch light. The house fell into darkness, a final barrier between us, a symbolic closing of the chapter. As I stood there in the dark, I whispered to myself, I gave her everything once. She threw it away with 3 words. Now I have nothing left to give her. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't even revenge. It was acceptance. Emily had made her choice, and now I had made mine. That night, I wrote a final entry in my journal. I didn't mention her by name. I simply wrote, "Some lessons are taught by words. Others are taught by silence. Tonight's silence was the only truth left to give." I closed the journal, set it on the table, and sat back down in my chair. Outside, the world carried on as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. The man who once clung to hope that his daughter still loved him had finally let go. The night I turned off the porch light, the house felt different. Not empty exactly. Emptiness is a hollow that begs to be filled, but cleared, as if I had finally moved a heavy piece of furniture that had been blocking the doorway for years. The air seemed easier to breathe. The quiet didn't accuse me anymore. It simply was. I made coffee at dawn and carried the mug to the back steps. A winter blue washed over the yard. Frost traced every blade of grass, the fence rails, the bird bath my wife loved. I sat there, palms warming against the ceramic, and let the cold work its way into me, just enough to sharpen my thoughts. I wasn't proud of everything it took to get here, but I wasn't ashamed either. I had chosen consequence over noise, meaning over spectacle. And now the day like my life could begin on clearer terms. In the weeks that followed, the donations moved from headlines to groundwork. The hospital's construction schedule arrived in a thick packet with diagrams and timelines. A social worker sent a note about a scholarship fund we'd structured first-generation students in Texas with a preference for those who'd lost a parent. I read that line twice and pressed my thumb into the paper like a signature of the heart. The foundation documents came back signed and sealed. The lawyers confirmed the estate plans, ironclad, precise, unambiguous. The hardware wallets remained where they had always been, but now they were instruments, not idols. I started saying yes to small things I'd once ignored. I said yes to the volunteer coordinator who asked if I might visit the hospital on Tuesdays to read to kids waiting for appointments. I said yes to the maintenance man at church who needed a hand rewiring the old fellowship hall lights. I even said yes to lunch with the neighbor who always waved from across the street but never knew what to say until the newspaper gave him a script. We talked about football and bad knees and how tomatoes never quite taste like you expect them to when you plant them yourself. I laughed more than I thought I would. Letters arrived stacked rubber-banded, some with childish handwriting and stickers. One envelope held a crayon drawing of a stick figure with a big smile standing beside a box labeled New Machine. A nurse had written a note, "It's the MRI. He thinks you bought it just for him." I put the drawing on my refrigerator with a magnet shaped like Texas and stood there, longer than a person should stand in front of an appliance, letting the simple thing steady me. Reporters kept calling. A national show asked if I'd fly out for an interview. I declined gently. I'd had enough of audiences that measured lives in sound bites. Besides, I already knew the only story I needed to tell, and the only person who had to hear it, the man I had to live with each morning in the mirror. As for Emily, the calls dwindled, then paused, then came once more in careful intervals, like a tide trying to learn a new shoreline. I didn't answer. I kept the letters I had written, one for her to receive when I'm gone, one to remain sealed in the safe beside my wife's ring. The letters aren't lectures. They aren't punishments. They are a record of what I carried, of what I chose, of a father's love that did not evaporate even when it could no longer open the door. If she ever reads them, she will know I wanted good for her long after I withdrew access to my life. She will know that love and access are not the same thing. Forgiveness arrived quietly, not as a pardon, but as a release. I stopped replaying the porch. I stopped rehearing those words the way a tongue worries a missing tooth. Some losses you don't fix. You resize your life around them. I kept my routines small and honest. Sweep the porch oil, the hinges bring the trash to the curb, call an old friend peel an orange, and eat it over the sink. I let the day be ordinary and let the ordinary save me. On a Tuesday at the hospital, I stood in the new lobby wing while a nurse explained how families would pass through this hall on their way to treatment rooms. She tapped a spot on the wall where a plaque would go my wife's name on it, not mine. That felt right. She was the person who taught me that generosity is a kind of engineering you solve for what hurts and build something that will hold. I pressed my palm to the drywall as if listening for a heartbeat behind it and promised her silently that the building would outlast our mistakes. I still attend church. I sit where I always have not, in the front with the photogenic donors, and not in the back with the latecomers, but in the middle where the sound gathers. When the choir sings, I don't pray for a changed past. I pray for steadiness. I pray for clear eyesight. I pray to keep choosing the road that leaves more light behind it than darkness. Sometimes at night, I take the safe key from its hook, open the door, and look at the quiet instruments of my revenge, the wallets, the documents, the folded letter. I don't touch them. I just confirm their silence. It calms me to know the plans are finished, not as a threat, but as a completed piece of work. I cared for something complicated and made it simple. I took the pressure that wealth exerts on love and redirected it into places where love is measured in meals and medicine and time. If Emily someday changes, if her apology one day arrives without invoices hidden inside it, there might be a table somewhere that can hold a cup of coffee between us. I won't rehearse that scene. I won't make it a condition for peace. Peace is already here, quiet as frost, ordinary as morning. What remains is a sentence I can carry without flinching. It isn't a triumphant line, and it isn't a lament. It's the truth turned over in a careful hand until it became smooth enough to pocket. I was never poor. Not when I pretended to be, not when I was told to leave, and not when I chose to give. I switch off the lights most evenings without ceremony. The porch stays dark. The yard holds its shape. Across town, a building rises that will open its doors to families I will never meet. That is enough. That is more than enough. And if a stranger ever asks why an old man in Dallas decided to take a private wound and make a public good out of it, I'll tell him this betrayal is a blade, but you can decide what to carve. I chose a corridor where footsteps echo toward help. I chose a plaque with my wife's name. I chose a silence that teaches. I pretended to lose everything. In truth, I only lost those who never truly loved me.